cashier's voice carried across the entire front of the store. "Declined." She said it twice, like saying it again might change the number on the screen. Marcus Webb stood 2 people back in line, watching an old woman in a green cardigan dig through her purse for a card that had already failed once. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the particular kind of shame that comes from being 70-some years old and short on grocery money in front of strangers. He had $47 in his checking account. He knew the number the way you know your own birthday, because he checked it twice that morning before deciding whether he could afford the gas to get to work for the rest of the week. He stepped forward anyway. "Put it on mine," he said, and set his card down before the cashier, or the old woman could argue about it. If you've ever been the one running the numbers in your head at the checkout line, praying the total comes in under what's left in your account, you already know what this moment cost him. Stay with this one until the end, because he had no idea who he'd just helped. And 6 days later, that decision would knock on his front door and change the rest of his life. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus Webb was exactly where he'd been for the last 6 years, standing at a workbench in a converted garage behind a rented house in Ashford County, hunched over a small engine, a headlamp strapped to his forehead because the overhead light had burned out and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. He was 41 years old, divorced, and raising a 9-year-old daughter named Ellie on his own. He fixed things for a living: lawnmowers, generators, the occasional outboard motor that some retiree brought in from the lake. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't pay well most months. But he was good at it, in the quiet, unglamorous way that doesn't get written up anywhere. His shop sat at the back of a gravel lot, a hand-painted sign out front that just said WEBB, our pair. No website, no social media. Just word of mouth and a waiting list that never seemed to shrink no matter how many hours he put in. Ellie did her homework at the little desk in the corner of the shop most afternoons because after-school care cost money he didn't have, and because she liked the smell of motor oil more than most 9-year-olds probably should. She was sharp, sharper than him some days. She'd look up from her math worksheet and ask him why a carburetor worked the way it did, and he'd stop what he was doing and actually explain it, because he figured a kid who asked real questions deserved real answers. That particular Tuesday, 3 weeks before the grocery store, money was tighter than usual. The truck needed a water pump. Ellie needed new shoes for school, the kind that don't fall apart in gym class. And a customer who owed him $400 for a rebuilt engine had been ducking his calls for going on 3 weeks. He didn't complain about it. Not to Ellie, not to anyone. He just did the math quietly, the way he did most things, and figured out what could wait and what couldn't. The grocery store was not, on that Tuesday 6 days before it mattered, someplace he wanted to be. But the refrigerator at home had a carton of eggs and not much else, and Ellie had a class party the next day that required a dozen cupcakes, and there was no version of the week where he showed up empty-handed. So he was there, doing math in his head at the cereal aisle, when he first noticed her. The old woman was 2 aisles over, and he wouldn't have thought twice about her except that she moved like someone counting every item against a number in her head, same as him. She put a can of soup back on the shelf after checking the price. Twice, she picked up a loaf of bread, looked at the tag, and set it back down for a cheaper one. He recognized the arithmetic. He didn't know her name, but he knew exactly what she was doing. Because he did it himself every single week. He didn't think much more about it. He got his eggs, his cupcake mix, a rotisserie chicken that was marked down because it was near closing, and got in line that was 3 weeks before. The Tuesday that mattered, the one with the decline card, was different only in that he happened to end up in the same line as her again. Same store, same tired fluorescent lights. Same old woman, though this time her cart was fuller, mostly canned goods and a couple of bags of dried beans. Food that stretches. She'd clearly been trying to make a small amount of money cover a large amount of need. The cashier ran her card. It came back, declined. The old woman blinked, apologized in the automatic way people do when they've been apologizing their whole lives, and asked the cashier to try again. Declined, the cashier said the second time, and her voice carried, because young cashiers sometimes don't know how to say a hard word quietly. The old woman started pulling items out of her cart, doing the math out loud under her breath. trying to whittle the total down to something her card would accept. Put back the canned peaches, put back the coffee. Her hands were shaking harder now. Marcus watched this from 2 spots back in line, and something in him made the decision before the rest of him had finished thinking it through. He stepped up, set his own groceries down on the belt behind hers, and told the cashier to put her total on his card. The old woman turned to him, startled, already shaking her head, already saying, "No, you don't have to. Please, I can just put some of it back." He didn't argue with her. He just told the cashier to run it. His account had $47 in it. Her total came to $31 and change. That left him $16 until Friday, when a small check was supposed to clear, assuming the man who owed him $400 didn't also owe the bank first. He did not tell her any of that. He didn't tell her his name either, not really. She asked him twice. He said something short, something like, "It's nothing, ma'am," and reached for his own groceries once the cashier had rung her out, and turned toward the door before she could get another word in. What he didn't know, because there was no reason he would have known it, was that the woman standing in front of him was named Eleanor Voss, and that Eleanor Voss ran the Ashford County Food Assistance Program, the same office that quietly kept nearly 900 families in that county fed every month. She wasn't there because she needed groceries for herself. Not exactly. She was there because her own benefits paperwork had been snagged in a processing error 2 weeks earlier, the kind of bureaucratic tangle she'd spent 30 years helping other people untangle. And for the first time in her professional life, she was on the wrong side of the counter. She hadn't told anyone at her office. She was too proud and too aware of the irony to make it anyone's business. She turned to the cashier the moment Marcus walked out the door, and she asked, with more urgency than the moment probably called for, if the cashier knew his name. The cashier, a 19-year-old named Priya, who had worked there long enough to know most of the regulars, said she thought his last name was Webb. Ran a repair shop out on Route 9. Paid for a lot of things for people, actually, now that she thought about it. There was an older man last month whose transmission fluid she'd heard he covered out of pocket. Nobody ever really talked about it because he never wanted them to. Eleanor Voss stood there in the checkout aisle a moment longer than she needed to, holding a bag of groceries she hadn't paid for, thinking about the kind of man who does something like that, and then leaves before you can say thank you. She was 66 years old. She had run the county's assistance program for 11 years, and before that had spent 19 years in the state's social services department, moving up through exactly the kind of institution that teaches you, eventually, to expect very little from people. She had seen fraud. She had seen cruelty, dressed up as policy. She had seen good programs gutted by bad administrators who cared more about optics than outcomes. She had also, in 11 years, seen exactly 4 moments of unprompted kindness that struck her as genuinely, structurally decent, the kind that reveals something about a person's whole architecture rather than just their mood that day. This made 5. She went home that night and didn't think about her own groceries. She thought about the man with the tired eyes and the grease under his fingernails, who'd paid for a stranger's groceries with what was obviously the last of what he had, and who hadn't wanted his name known for it. The next morning, she made 2 phone calls. The first was to a friend at the county clerk's office asking, in the roundabout way people ask about someone without quite admitting why. Whether there was a business registered under the name Webb Repair. There was. Sole proprietor, Marcus Webb. License current. No violations. No complaints on file. 6 years in operation. The second call was to the Ashford County Board of Commissioners, on whose advisory committee Eleanor Voss had quietly sat for the better part of a decade. Mostly attending meetings nobody else wanted to attend, mostly getting overruled on things that mattered. She had heard, through that committee, about a grant. The Bennett Foundation, a private philanthropic fund established 2 decades earlier by the late Arthur Bennett, a manufacturing magnate who'd made his money in the county and never quite left it behind, had recently announced a new community initiative. $60,000 awarded annually to a small local business or tradesperson demonstrating what the foundation's charter called, in language nobody had updated since 1998, exceptional character in service of the community. It was not a large grant by national standards. It had also, in its 4 years of existence, never once gone to anyone who actually needed it. It had gone, every year, to businesses connected to a man named Russell Finch. Russell Finch was the executive director of the Bennett Foundation, a position he had held for 6 years, ever since Arthur Bennett's death had left the foundation's board, mostly ceremonial and mostly elderly, and mostly willing to defer to whoever seemed to be handling the details. Finch was 52, silver-haired, expensively dressed, in a way that always seemed slightly too deliberate for a county with one stoplight, and he ran the foundation's annual grant like it was his own personal checking account. The grant, in practice, went to Finch's golfing partners. It went to a car dealership owned by his brother-in-law. It went, one particularly brazen year, to a landscaping company that turned out to be owned by Finch's own wife under her maiden name, a detail nobody on the geriatric trusting board had bothered to check. Eleanor Voss knew all of this. She had sat in board meetings and watched it happen. End quote. She had raised the question once, gently, in her second year on the committee, about how the grant recipients were selected, and had been told by Finch, with the smooth, unbothered confidence of a man who has never once been challenged and won, that the selection process was thorough, confidential, and not something the advisory committee needed to concern itself with. She had not raised it again, not because she agreed with his answer, but because she had learned, over 3 decades in institutions like this one, that some fights you can't win from the position she held, and that spending your credibility on a fight you'll lose just means you have less credibility left for the fight you might actually win. But this year, she had an idea she intended to make very difficult to ignore. She drove out to Route 9 on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after the grocery store, and found Webb Repair exactly where the county clerk's record said it would be. A gravel lot, a hand-painted sign, a garage door standing open to the afternoon heat. Marcus was under a riding mower when she pulled in, and he rolled out on the creeper the way mechanics do, wiping his hands on a rag, not recognizing her at first, because he'd barely looked at her at the grocery store either. She introduced herself, told him her name and where she worked, and watched something shift very slightly behind his eyes when the pieces connected. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just nodded, the way a man nods when a fact confirms something he'd already half suspected. "You didn't need to come out here to thank me," he said. "It wasn't anything. It was something," Eleanor said, "and I'm not here to thank you. I'm here because I think your business should be nominated for a grant, and I wanted to ask you in person rather than send a form letter you'd probably throw away." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that Eleanor would come to recognize over the following weeks as his default posture toward anything that sounded too good. He asked her what the catch was. "There isn't one," she said. "There's an application, there's a review, and there's a man who runs the process who I don't entirely trust, which is exactly why I want you in it." Marcus glanced back toward the shop where Ellie was visible through the open door, hunched over her homework at the little desk, glancing up occasionally to watch the stranger talking to her father. He asked Eleanor what the grant would actually mean, in practical terms, if it came through. $60,000, she told him, for equipment, expansion, whatever the business needs to grow. He didn't say anything for a long moment. $60,000 was not an abstraction to a man who had $16 in his account 4 days earlier. It was a new lift. It was paying off the truck. It was not lying awake, calculating whether Ellie's shoes could wait another month. He told Eleanor he'd fill out the application. He didn't say thank you, not exactly. He just nodded once, like a man agreeing to a job that needed doing, and went back to the mower. Eleanor Voss drove home that evening with the particular satisfaction of a person who has, for the first time in a while, put a piece back on the board, instead of just watching it get taken. She underestimated, at that point, exactly how hard Russell Finch would fight to keep it from happening. The application process, on paper, was straightforward. Any county business owner could apply. Applications went through an initial screening by the foundation's small staff, which consisted mostly of Finch and an assistant named Carla, who had learned in her 4 years working for him exactly which questions not to ask. Finalists were presented to the board, 5 aging community figures who trusted Finch's judgment because they had no particular reason not to, at least until now. Marcus filled out the application at his kitchen table one night after Ellie had gone to bed, in the same careful, unhurried handwriting he used for invoices. He listed his years in business, his training, and the types of repairs he specialized in. He did not embellish anything. He listed his revenue honestly, which was modest, and his reason for wanting the grant just as plainly: to expand the shop, hire a part-time apprentice, and stop turning away work because he didn't have the equipment to take it on. He mailed it himself, rather than trust the Dropbox, the way he did most things that mattered. Russell Finch received the application on a Monday, along with 11 others. He read through them the way he read through all of them, which was to say quickly, and mostly to identify which ones he could set aside without much scrutiny. Webb Repair. He didn't recognize the name, which in itself was mildly irritating, because Finch prided himself on knowing which businesses in the county were worth knowing. He set it in the stack of applicants. He had no intention of advancing, alongside 8 others, keeping only 2 in play. Boutique winery owned by a man Finch played poker with, and as a nod to appearing impartial, a bakery owned by someone with no connection to him at all, which he intended to lose narrowly in the final vote. He did not expect Eleanor Voss to attend the preliminary review meeting. She rarely did. Her seat on the advisory committee was largely ceremonial, a courtesy extended to the county's social services department, more as a formality than an actual channel of influence, and Finch had long since stopped considering her a variable worth accounting for. This was, as it turned out, the single largest miscalculation of his 6 years running the foundation. Eleanor showed up to the preliminary review with a folder. Inside the folder were the 11 applications, a printed county business registry, and 4 years of the foundation's own annual reports, which she had requested, through entirely legal and entirely public channels, from the state's non-profit oversight office. She waited until Finch had finished his summary, which took 11 minutes and included exactly 1 sentence about each of the 8 applicants he'd already decided not to advance, before she asked to speak. She asked why Webb Repair, an application she found compelling, had been excluded before the full committee even had a chance to review it. Finch, without missing a beat, said the application lacked sufficient financial documentation to establish viability. Eleanor set a copy of Marcus's application on the table, opened to the page in question, and asked him to point to which document was missing, since she'd reviewed it herself and found 3 years of tax filings, a current business license, and 2 customer references. Finch said he'd need to review it again before commenting further. She said that was fine. She'd wait. He did not, in that meeting, have an answer that held up. And for the first time in 4 years, a grant recipient was not decided in the room where Russell Finch expected it to be decided. What Finch did next, over the following 10 days, was the part that would eventually cost him everything. He called Carla into his office and had her pull together a memo, backdated to appear as though it had been written before the preliminary meeting, listing supposed concerns about Marcus Webb's business, unlicensed work performed outside his registered trade classification, and unresolved complaint from a customer. Pattern of cash transactions that the memo characterized, in language borrowed loosely from financial compliance training, as potentially concerning. None of it was true. Carla knew none of it was true, because she was the one being asked to invent it, and she typed it anyway, because Finch had made it clear in the particular way he always made things clear without ever quite saying them out loud, that her job depended on being useful rather than being honest. Finch presented the memo to the board a week later, as though it had come from an internal compliance review. He recommended Webb Repair be disqualified from consideration entirely, on the grounds that the foundation could not risk its reputation on an applicant with, in his words, an irregular business history. 3 of the 5 board members nodded along, the way people do when a confident voice tells them something in a tone that doesn't invite questions. The 4th board member, a woman named Diane Osei, who had served on the board for 9 years and asked more questions than the rest of them combined, asked to see the source documents behind the memo. Finch said the source documents were part of an ongoing internal review and weren't available for distribution yet, but that he stood behind the findings. Diane didn't push further in the meeting, but she mentioned, on her way out to Eleanor Voss, that something about the memo's timeline didn't sit right with her. That was the opening Eleanor needed. She drove back out to Route 9 the next afternoon, not to deliver bad news exactly, but to ask Marcus a direct question. Had he ever had a customer complaint filed against him, formally with the county or the state licensing board? Marcus said no. Not once, in 6 years. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without defensiveness, because he didn't feel the need to convince anyone of something he knew to be true. Eleanor believed him immediately, not because she was naturally trusting. 30 years in her line of work had cured her of that, but because she had learned to recognize the difference between a man protesting his innocence and a man simply stating a fact he'd never had reason to think twice about. She asked if he'd mind if she checked. He said he didn't mind at all. She spent the next 4 days doing exactly the kind of methodical, unglamorous work that Marcus himself would have recognized and respected, had he known the extent of it. She filed a public records request with the state licensing board for any complaints on record against Webb Repair. There were none. She contacted the 2 customer references listed on his application, both of whom spoke about him in the unprompted, specific way people speak about someone who actually helped them. One describing a repair Marcus had done for half the estimate everyone else had quoted, simply because he'd found a cheaper part that worked just as well and didn't feel right charging for parts he didn't use. She cross-referenced the supposed cash transaction pattern in Finch's memo against Marcus's tax filings, which were a matter of public record, and found no inconsistency at all. The number Finch's memo cited didn't match anything in the actual filings. It appeared to have been invented outright. By the end of the 4th day, Eleanor had built, in a manila folder, not unlike the one Marcus kept his own invoices in, an almost complete picture of exactly how false the memo was and exactly how little effort had gone into making it convincing. What she didn't yet have was proof of who had actually written it and why. That piece came from an unexpected source. Carla, the assistant who had typed the memo at Finch's direction, had spent 4 years absorbing the particular kind of quiet moral erosion that comes from being asked, repeatedly, to put your name near things you know aren't true. She had a mortgage. She had a teenage son. She had told herself, more times than she wanted to count, that it wasn't her job to police her boss's ethics, only to do the work in front of her. But there was something about the specificity of what she'd been asked to fabricate this time. An actual person's business, an actual person's livelihood, invented flaws with invented numbers that sat differently than the usual vague language Finch preferred when steering the grant toward his friends. She still had the original file on her computer. The metadata on it showed the memo had been created 6 days after the preliminary meeting, not before it. Exactly the discrepancy Diane Osei had sensed without being able to name. Carla didn't come forward all at once. And she came forward the way most people who've spent years going along with something finally do, in a single conversation that felt, to her, like stepping off a ledge she'd been standing on for longer than she wanted to admit. She called Eleanor Voss on a Tuesday evening and asked if they could meet somewhere that wasn't the Foundation's office. They met at a diner off the highway. Carla brought a flash drive. On it was the original file with its true creation date, along with 3 years of internal emails in which Russell Finch had, with varying degrees of subtlety, directed grant outcomes toward friends, family, and business associates. Occasionally, in language explicit enough that Eleanor had to read certain lines twice to be sure she understood them correctly. One email sent the previous year read, "Keep the woodworking guy in 3rd place. No need to make it look too easy for Danny." Danny was Finch's brother-in-law. The woodworking guy had been a hospice volunteer, running a small furniture repair business out of his garage, the kind of applicant the Foundation's charter had actually been written to help. Eleanor read through the emails twice, the way she read anything that confirmed a suspicion she'd been sitting on for years without proof. The first time, to understand what she was looking at. The second time, to make sure the anger she felt didn't cause her to misread something that needed to be exactly right when she brought it forward. She thanked Carla, told her she understood what it had cost her to come forward, and asked one more question. Would she be willing to say all of this on the record, in front of the full board? Carla said yes, quietly, but she said it. The full board meeting was scheduled for the second Thursday of the following month, the annual meeting where the grant recipient would be formally announced. Russell Finch had already told 3 of the 5 board members, informally, over lunches and phone calls, that the bakery would be this year's winner, framing it as a heartwarming, uncontroversial choice that would generate good local press for the foundation. He had not told them about Webb Repair at all, having successfully removed it from consideration weeks earlier. What Finch did not know, walking into that boardroom with his usual unhurried confidence, was that Diane Osei had spent the preceding weeks quietly convening the other board members outside his knowledge at Eleanor's request, and that Eleanor had shared with them in advance the full folder, the fabricated memo, the metadata discrepancy, and Carla's account, along with printed copies of the emails. She had also, at Diane's suggestion, invited someone else to attend the meeting, someone whose presence Finch would not expect, and whose authority he would not be able to talk his way around. Margaret Bennett was 78 years old and had not attended a foundation board meeting in nearly 6 years. She was Arthur Bennett's daughter, technically still a board member emeritus, a title that had, under Finch's tenure, become mostly ceremonial, an old woman's name on a letterhead nobody expected to actually show up. She showed up. She had been contacted by Diane Osei 10 days earlier, and after reading through Eleanor's folder in full, twice sitting alone at her kitchen table with the same careful, deliberate attention, Eleanor herself, brought to a difficult document, she had made exactly one phone call. Not to Finch. To her lawyer, confirming that as a board member emeritus, she retained full voting rights whenever she chose to exercise them, a detail buried in bylaws nobody had looked at in over a decade. She arrived at the boardroom 11 minutes before the meeting started and took a seat at the head of the table that had, for 6 years, been considered Russell Finch's by unspoken default. Finch walked in at the scheduled time, saw her sitting there, and, to his credit, did not visibly falter, though something in his posture straightened in the particular way of a man recalculating. He began the meeting, the way he began all of them, with practiced warmth, thanking everyone for their time, previewing what he called an exciting announcement about this year's grant recipient. He spoke about the bakery, about community impact, about the foundation's proud tradition of supporting local business. Margaret Bennett let him finish the entire speech before she spoke. She asked him to explain the discrepancy between the date on a compliance memo regarding an applicant named Marcus Webb and the metadata showing when that memo had actually been created. Finch said he wasn't sure what she was referring to, that he'd need to look into it. She said that was fine. She'd wait. It was, Eleanor would think later, almost exactly what she herself had said to him weeks earlier, and watching him hear it from someone he couldn't dismiss was one of the more quietly satisfying moments of her professional life. Finch tried for a few minutes to talk his way through it, using the same smooth, confident, slightly condescending tone he'd used successfully for 6 years. On a board that had never once pushed back, he suggested there might have been a clerical error. He suggested Carla might have mislabeled the file. He suggested with a faint note of offense, entering his voice, that he found it troubling anyone would question his integrity after everything he'd built here. Margaret Bennett asked Carla, who had been invited to attend and was sitting quietly near the back of the room, whether she'd like to say anything. Carla did. She spoke for about 4 minutes without notes, describing exactly how the memo had come to exist, exactly what she'd been asked to write and why, and exactly what she'd found when she went back through years of emails after her conscience finally outweighed her fear of losing her job. She named Denny. She named the winery owner. She named the hospice volunteer, whose furniture business had been quietly, deliberately kept out of first place the year before, for no reason other than convenience. Finch's expression, through all 4 minutes of this, did not collapse dramatically. It simply, slowly, emptied. The particular hollowing out of a man watching 6 years of careful arrangement come apart in real time, in a room he no longer controlled. He tried once more to reframe it, calling Carla's account a misunderstanding, calling the emails taken out of context. Margaret Bennett read one of the emails aloud herself, the one about keeping the woodworking guy in 3rd place. There was no context that made it mean something else. The board voted, that same afternoon, to suspend Russell Finch from his position effective immediately, pending a full independent review of every grant awarded during his tenure. He was escorted from the building by the same quiet, unhurried process that had once let him escort other people's futures out the door without a second thought. Marcus Webb learned about all of it the following week, when Eleanor Voss drove back out to Route 9 for the third time and told him plainly that Webb Repair had been awarded the grant, and that the process that had briefly tried to shut him out had, in the end, been the thing that exposed years of quiet corruption nobody else had been willing to challenge. He didn't celebrate the way people do in movies. He set down the wrench he was holding, wiped his hands on the same rag he always used, and asked, first, whether the money was really his to use however the shop needed. No strings. Eleanor said, yes. No strings. He nodded once. Then he asked how Carla was doing, because he'd heard through Eleanor what it had cost her to come forward, and he wanted to know if she'd landed on her feet. It was, Eleanor thought. Most people told they'd just been awarded $60,000. Asked about the money, he asked about the woman who'd risked her job to make sure the money went where it was supposed to. The following months were not dramatic. That was, in its own way, the most satisfying part. Marcus used the grant exactly as he'd said he would. He bought equipment that let him take on larger repair jobs he'd been turning away for years. He hired a part-time apprentice, a 19-year-old named Tyler, who'd been failing out of the county's vocational program, mostly out of boredom, and who turned out, under Marcus's patient, methodical teaching, to have real hands for the work. The foundation, under new interim leadership that included both Diane Osei and, at her insistence, Margaret Bennett stepping back into a more active role, revised its grant process entirely. Applications were now reviewed by a rotating panel rather than a single director. Every recipient's financials were independently verified. The bylaws were rewritten to prevent any one person from holding unilateral control over anything again. Eleanor Voss was asked, formally, to join the Foundation's board in a permanent, non-ceremonial capacity, the kind of seat with actual authority attached to it. She accepted, on one condition, that she keep her position running the county assistance program too, because she had no intention of trading the work that actually mattered to her for a title. She and Marcus stayed in touch in the unhurried way two careful people do. A coffee here, a phone call there, mostly about the shop, sometimes about nothing in particular. He fixed the water pump on her car for free one afternoon over her objections, and she let him. Eventually, because she understood by then that arguing with him about it wasn't a fight worth having. Ellie, for her part, adopted Eleanor with the straightforward confidence of a 9-year-old who decides she likes someone and sees no reason to complicate it. She started asking Eleanor questions about the food program the same way she asked her father about carburetors, wanting to know how it actually worked, who it actually helped, why some families qualified and others didn't. Eleanor found herself, more than once, explaining policy details to a 9-year-old with the same care she'd have given a state auditor because the questions were, honestly, just as good. On a Saturday morning about 4 months after the grocery store, Marcus stood in the doorway of his shop, watching Ellie and Eleanor sit together at the little corner desk, poring over one of Ellie's school assignments about community helpers, Eleanor patiently explaining what a caseworker actually did all day. He thought, not for the first time, about the $31 and change he'd spent that Tuesday, back when he had $47 to his name, and $16 left over after he had not done it expecting anything. That was, in the end, the only reason any of what followed had actually meant something. He hadn't been buying goodwill or angling for a grant he didn't know existed. He'd just done the thing that seemed obviously necessary at the time, the way he approached most of his life, and let the rest of it sort itself out. It had sorted itself out, eventually, though not in a way he could have predicted, and not without exposing, along the way, exactly how much quiet corruption a system can absorb before someone simply refuses to look away from it. He picked up the wrench again and got back to work, because there was always more work, and because that, more than the grant, more than the recognition, more than any of it, was the part of his life that had never once needed fixing.